Hello, everybody. If we're building the future and building the machines that are building that future, what kind of future are we building? Who's being excluded from creating that future? And who's being excluded from those data sets that are training the machines that are building that future? In this Arize Observed conversation, I'm thrilled to learn from three women, Brianna, Behar, and Sean, who are wildly experienced for their respective AI fields and are truly committed to helping other people join and feel like they belong in this future building. I'm Jennifer Riggins. You can find me at JK Riggins or in the Slack community. And I'm going to be asking the questions right now, but don't forget you can add in the comments in the chat. And also the best way to continue the conversation is with a community, the Slack community. So go ahead, and if you haven't joined the Arize AI Slack community yet, do it, and we'll continue the conversation there. So just as a caveat, obviously this has women in AI in the title, and that's a nifty hashtag and title and all, but I want to make sure everyone knows that we aim this conversation to be inclusive of a broader definition of women, including those that are non-binary and trans women and all minoritized people. And especially also, this is a conversation that a lot of allies should listen to as well, as often those most minoritized in tech or any community really are the ones leading these conversations and doing the work. Don't forget, allies are if you want to be a real ally, you have to do the work. And really, our future literally depends on this. So I hope everyone is listening and we have a diverse audience, and diverse in the opposite of what I would mean in any other tech community, which means diverse as in white men are actually listening to this conversation too, because they're usually the ones that have to do the work. So I just want to thank y'all for joining us today, no matter what time zone you're in during our conference today. And thank you for joining this conversation. And I just want to give a chance to let our esteemed panel to introduce themselves. Brianna, do you want to start?
Of course, yeah, sorry about that. Hi, everyone. My name is Brianna Vecchioni. I'm currently a PhD student in information science at Cornell. And my work addresses issues of measurement and evaluation in AI, with particular attention to systemic issues of discrimination, as well as their implications for both accountability as well as public policy. So lately, I've been interested in exploring some of the processes involved in algorithmic auditing, both by studying early discrimination studies in the social sciences, as well as surveying current AI auditing tooling.
Super interesting and vitally important. So thank you for that research. Sean, how about you introduce yourself?
Sure. My name is Sean Ramirez, Sean Lee Ramirez. I am a former political science professor. I taught at Emory and Harvard University for about 10 years before moving out of academia and into the world of AI. I've become really passionate, not just about data science, but really about artificial intelligence, really understanding how to scale AI for good products and think about how we can impact the world in a positive way. I currently work at Shelf Engine, where I'm the head of data science. It's a complex AI product that we are working on to solve the global food waste problem and tackle climate change in addition to that. I am extremely passionate at my company about developing a highly diverse and collaborative team and making sure that we are continuing to advance society in terms of creating professional advancement, pay equity, and positive work-life balance for everyone at our company, and hopefully inspiring the rest of the tech community as well.
As a fellow, yeah, I was going to just say, as a fellow poli-sci grad, you may not be working in political science anymore, academia or campaigns, but you're certainly affecting the future positively. So that's great. And Behar, please.
Yeah, hi everyone. Bahar Sateli. I'm a senior manager in advanced analytics and AI practice at PwC Canada. By background, I'm a computer scientist and a software engineer. By nature, I'm a very hands-on person when it comes to tech. But I always like to say that at my current position at PwC, I wear many hats. One of them is obviously a very technical hat. So we are the ones who are helping our clients build the systems of the future, as we talked earlier here. But my other hat, which is a challenging one to wear, but the one I'm certainly proud of, is co-leading our responsible AI practice. This is quite a challenging position because yes, I advise our clients in implementation and finding use cases and finding the right data that fits the problem and assessing the feasibility and ultimately implementing it for them. But responsible AI is everything around it as well. So this is advising our clients on the ethical implication of the use cases that they aspire to build. Simply put, we always say just because you can build it, does it mean that you really want to build it, right? So we help our clients answer these tough questions, not just from the ethical side, but also making sure that they're investing on the products that can be legally operated under the law and they won't violate the end users' rights and liberties that are exposed to them, and everything else in the spectrum. So I can speak all day about bias and fairness and robustness of these models, but these are the typical issues that I have to deal with on a daily basis at my job.
I'm just curious, how often did they expect to have responsible tech reviews and advisory before they start the project, and how often are they a bit taken aback and not prepared to answer these questions?
That's an excellent question, and that's also the message that we're trying to get across every time, that responsible AI is not an addition to your data science practice. It's not a luxury item to be added to your operations. It's something that needs to be there from day one. We even argue that you really need to sit down and put together an AI strategy and understand where your Northern Star is before you start looking into your very first use case or your very first data sets, or even when you hire a data scientist, right? Because nowadays, it's with the availability of data and computing platforms, creating or training a model is not really that difficult anymore, right? But understanding what you're going to do with it and how people are impacted ultimately by that use case is a very tough question and needs everyone. It's a decision that needs everyone on the table. So you're going to need participation from the data science folks as much as you need participation from the C-level executive. So we try to make sure that they understand it from day one.
That's fantastic. And just to not be women downplaying, it sounds pretty impressive. And I don't think it's as easy as you think it is to train data still. But that training humans to actually care for other humans and consider that in their agile processes, et cetera, it's still probably harder than teaching machines to autonomously think, sadly. Let's start by getting to the basics before we can start talking about equitable systems and equitable code and equitable futures. There needs to be more diversity, equity, inclusion in the people that are building those futures, right? So how do you measure diversity, equity, inclusion at your organization? Sean, I know you're very detailed, I believe, in your organization about measuring these things, and you can't really improve what you can't measure, right?
Yeah, I think, women and men, actually, everyone across race, ethnicity, across all sorts of protected classes, ask the question regularly of like, how do we create diversity at our company? It absolutely starts with the recruiting funnel, making sure your recruiting pipeline is strong to bring in diverse people, as well as, of course, bringing that value to the company so that people have that at the forefront of their minds when they're thinking about hiring and what the importance is in terms of our machine learning pipelines, our product team, the staffing that we have on various teams, even our recruiters. We may want those recruiters to also be diverse so that they can be thinking ahead on these different fronts. And at the same time, those things have to roll up to things that we can measure so that we can understand and track and iterate on our strategies to create better processes around these things. So making sure our recruiting pipelines have the right numbers in them, making sure we have outreach in the right areas or to the right number of groups, making sure we have strong community support with the number of universities that we work with. We have an internship program. We have 43, I think, % currently of women in leadership roles at my company. That's something we have strived to continue to achieve, a balanced 50-50 ratio. So while we're excited to applaud ourselves also with 43%, we know that still means there is work ahead of us, and that has to be reflected at every single level in the entire company and across teams as well. So not just in fields that are more traditionally diverse, but also in tech teams, especially where that diversity is often or can be overlooked. So creating the right numbers there for our diversity funnels or understanding that and putting that at the forefront of those OKRs for those teams who are forming those partnerships is really important. Having good alignment across the leadership so we understand why we're investing in taking this time to scope our teams the right way. And then understanding and reflecting back to what Bahar was talking about, why is it important for our product? It's going to affect the quality of our output and the quality of our modeling, because those people are going to be looking at the data in a different way. And we all understand, garbage in, garbage out. I think what we have yet to really understand is that when we have bias in, we get bias out. And so we should start thinking about that, or thinking in terms of that as we move forward in DE&I, about bringing and surfacing those numbers as well to how DE&I impacts the quality of the product at our company. Mm-hmm. So a bunch of different numbers there, from recruiting numbers, product insights and KRs for different teams, bias in our model and understanding that and surfacing those and creating strong metrics around those, I think are all different ways at a company level that we can integrate DE&I more positively.
Mm-hmm. Bahar, is there anything you want to add that's happening with your team or at PwC overall?
Absolutely. We also look at this issue at hand from very different perspectives. One of the more obvious cases is that we're also trying to look into equity in terms of our recruitment, which is also challenging because just traditionally we see less female applicants or people who identify as females applying to this high-tech roles. We are making a lot of effort to go to community to raise awareness around the fact that we have positions for you. Come and apply and let us, worst case scenario, you're just going to get some really good feedback on your interview, right? And then that makes you stronger for your second time around or the third time around. So there is one avenue, which is our recruitment. The other thing is that we also believe that we have to practice what we preach. So for the ones that we have already hired, we have all these training workshops where we talk not just on a high level of what it means to bring diversity and unbiased data set to your data set, the data science practice, but really sit down with a data scientist and talk math and tell them what it takes for you to calculate whether you're creating fair models. And if you have to make compromises, how do you actually objectively measure those? How do you document them? How do you hold an informative, meaningful conversation with the ultimate owners of their model and making sure that they understand what they're buying and what are the possible, the use cases or the situations where that model is going to be used, but what are the limitations? So not only we're trying to bring diversity in terms of people who are building the systems, but we also want to make sure that they have a clear idea of what it means to create these unbiased models for the future.
But documentation, and I've written about this a lot now, tends to be an afterthought, tends to be at constant conflict with rapid release cycles. These all sound great, but how do you get the message across that we know they're important, but how do you get that message across that they are actually that important, that they actually get factored into a sprint or something? Because even in like API documentation that faces the public, it's something that is crap everywhere. So, or almost everywhere, the 99%. So how do you actually get them to fit that into their timetable and their sprint?
Absolutely. So one practice that we usually encourage, and we've created some formalized processes around it, is the idea of creating what we call a model sheet. These are akin to a nutritional label for any food packaging that you want to kind of buy. And that nutrition label, if you will, has to have a set of required information. And we use those documentation in the process of approving a model before it goes to production. So there are certain checklists. Some of these items on that checklist are, admittedly, some of them are subjective, but some of them are actually objective. You actually have to provide metrics and measures, and somebody has to look at it in the, in the chain of command for that model to get approved. So by the time your model goes into production, this is not going to be an afterthought. This is not going to be an optional documentation to generate. It's the in a very loose sense of that term, it's an audit trail of how that model came to be. And that can be used to monitor it, that can be used to do a little bit of a risk tiering, as we always say, because the risk that a model can bring directly translates to what kind of control measures you want to put around it.
Wow, I speak for everyone. If it's not proprietary to PwC, if you want to share that later, an example of the nutritional label that factors in human in the loop and audit trail, etc., please go to the Slack after our conversation and share it, because I'm sure people are going to have questions and a lot of people are going to want to. I've never heard of this before, and I've been working with responsible tech ethics for a while, so it's great. That's fascinating. Maybe we should have started with Brianna, though, if we thought about it, because really academia should, okay, in tech in general, we should be less reliant on academia, but certainly in machine learning, AI and all, it is much more of a requirement, a more reasonable requirement than other roles, I would say. So it is often the step before people get to the office. Or so just tell us everything about how it's going in the future of the future of the future of the future of building tech. Tell us about academia and what measures are being done there that you're seeing, at least, Brianna.
Yeah, of course. I mean, on a broader sense, I think there's a lot more awareness and discussion around issues like transparency for both our practices as well as our systems, especially when you're using AI for employment as well, right? Right now, it's kind of hard because a lot of vendors aren't necessarily willing or particularly attuned to disclosing their hiring practice. So a lot of times we really just don't know what, how, or why they're doing what they're doing. And I think that prompts some discussion to be had around how policy and governance can help enforce stronger oversight as well as accountability. And you're seeing that a lot in academia right now. So one example, right, is, Title VII prohibits employment discrimination. And, one of these measures includes something called disparate impact, which is basically measured through something called the 4/5 rule, which basically says, if the selection rate for one protected group is less than 4/5 of the group that ends up having the highest selection rate, then the employer actually needs to show how the selection procedures are necessary, right? So saying, there's no better procedure that exists to measure this thing and also valid. So a lot of academics right now are encouraging more bias sensitive measures as well. And one particular one that's being discussed a lot is something called differential validity. And this happens, right, when some procedure performs better for some group of protected group members versus another. And employers, they usually don't collect things like sensitive attributes. And a lot of them are actually avoidant to check for these sorts of things because of the legal risk surrounding, these issues of adverse impact. So we're seeing, a lot of limitations. And, like you and Bahar mentioned, another very famous one is the representativeness of a data set, right? Making sure that we ensure for proper documentation. And, it's great. But I think that a lot of vendors are just recently starting to become aware of the importance of this. So, you can't claim validity without accurate representation. And, there aren't a lot of policy enforced ways of doing that right now. But we're seeing a lot of awareness and we're seeing some initial steps, documentation being one of them. So that's heartening for sure.
Wow, it's really interesting. Actually, in the UK, they collect a ridiculous amount of data. Like, they just never share it. Like, we have things trickle out sometimes, like maternal death rate being higher for Black women. That are very important things that are slipped out or eventually published, but it's not shared very often, different things like that. And obviously we know with the coronavirus that was very clear very quickly, the discrepancies in medical care, and it just goes across the board. But I'm not sure if this was known in North America as much, but with International Women's Day earlier this month, there was @PayGap app, and they were every time someone tweeted, this is amazing. They had a bot that every time someone tweeted, a UK-based business tweeted something for International Women's Day, which, by the way, some of it was wildly inappropriate. Like, look how thin and trim this person is, and I saw, and stuff like that. And then they would automatically quote tweet and share the pay gap in the company. It's on the binary, but it was fascinating. Or sometimes there was an occasional company that pay gap in the other way, like, or we're even, and it was great. But most of them were extraordinarily bad. And then they'd start deleting their tweets, but it would show up as a blank quote tweet and all. And it was just amazing. So that was a great use of data and application of AI or chatbots and things. So I think that's really great, because if we don't publish our diversity, equity, inclusion data, we're not going to be accountable. And we know we are in any way. When you publish, look at Buffer. We know when Buffer published their salaries, they saw triple the amount of applications. And that's still true to this day because they were transparent. So transparency should be an easy sell for customer support, marketing, and sales, but we'll see. So it's not just enough about this recruitment and this good data. Like, we also have to retain. And as we've learned over the last couple of years, even talking about Dr. Gabru and from people, we know that women and Black women, people of color, work twice, tripling as hard to get where they are. So we know they deserve to get there, but then it can be horrible when they get there. So how do you create belonging towards retention? Sean, I know you have a lot of thoughts on this specific. How do you even measure if people are happy at work?
It's a constant effort. Being in leadership and sitting in senior leadership meetings, it is very complicated. Trying to create opportunity to commit to the pulse of the company, to stay in tune with it, and to give enough transparency back so that people know that you're doing the right thing is very hard. It is a constant effort. We have pulse surveys that we do where we are very specific about the level of anonymity that we retain, because we need to be very careful about whether we want to action on something that is the result of that pulse survey or whether we don't. And if we want to action on something, then we may want less anonymity, so we take actions in the right place. We may want more anonymity so that we increase the chances of somebody opening up and telling something. So there's all sorts of ways that we should think carefully about how we even collect that data, and how we store that data. Of course, there are levels beyond that we have to think about. And how we share that internally, even among the leadership. How do we share that data and the reports that go out afterward and talk about it and action on that properly is very hard. And then there are levels that we create that are very informal, that we don't necessarily track and have numbers on, but that are really important to helping to establish a more equitable workplace. So things like making sure we have good career coaching at all levels, making sure that we have a strong commitment to coaching up. Even the most junior person coming in is a person, and helping them understand, like, what does self-identification mean here? What does that mean for you? And what kinds of internal biases do you have when you ask your manager for a certain task? Are you asking for the right task that is going to help you get to the next level in your career? And helping managers understand and navigate that so that they can constantly coach up and bring those people to a better level is a constant effort also. And there's no playbook, as far as I know, on how this is done in the right way, right? We're creating the playbook as we go. Just like Bahar was talking about in terms of creating this model manifest or this data manifest, that's a growing practice so that we can create the right numbers. There's a constant growing practice also to create the right culture that brings that together. Things like virtual happy hours, that career coaching aspect, making sure we have good mentoring and onboarding during initial phases when somebody comes on board so that they have a technical scientific person to connect with, but also so that they have somebody, a peer in the company that they can talk to about other things. Making sure that women reach out and minorities reach out who may not have someone who looks like them at the company is really important so that we can understand how our biases translate, as well as how other people interpret their own biases and ways that you can experience that. So, and then maintaining a strong culture of constant training because the fields are developing. We had a recent we bring in consultants outside to give us DE&I expertise in the company and to give us training formally on this to improve everything from how we hire and how we interview to reduce those biases to how we action on that as a leadership team to make the right decisions. So there's all kinds of interesting experts in the field that we want to bring in their expertise and make sure that we're integrating that constant commitment to DE&I across the company.
Create jobs, hire people, spend money on those external consultants for sure. What's interesting is I was just thinking the last time I had like I don't want to say a real job because that's demeaning to what I do, but a normative job at a company was, I don't know, 15 years ago or something. And I remember the sexual harassment was an online course that you could take, well, an online questionnaire. And you would have a book, like an actual book that was the guide of the organization. And it's extraordinary how much that has changed. But I wonder if that's only because we're in a happy little modern bubble of, and there are probably many companies that still go, boop, there's your employee handbook, please read it. And no one ever reads it. And then you have a quick quiz that you should not touch a woman's ass or something. I remember it being very ridiculous, but you still don't want to get it wrong, but it's just ridiculous that a lot of companies look at it as like a check mark. So I think your organization is doing something extraordinary.
And this has become so much more complex, right? We're globally more connected. We have remote workplaces now. We have people we're hiring from all over the world, teams all over the world. Like, how do you manage that difference and even hire by paying attention to your biases, right? Every one of us has some kind of bias. So really paying attention to that, thinking about those numbers coming in, thinking about what extra data we can collect to create things that we can validate and verify on the other end on the downstream impact of our models, of our practices, of our hiring processes and retention processes. Bahar, you look like you're gonna.
Yeah, and one other thing. So I have absolutely understand the value of coaching, and this is something that we take really, really seriously at PwC. In fact, we have a one-on-one coaching assistant. So every person who works at PwC, at least in our practice, actually has a coach that takes care of the health and safety and overall happiness of their career path while they're at the firm. But I also want to add and acknowledge and recognize how much support we're also given from our partners. In fact, just 2 days ago, our lead responsible AI partner in our firm, Innovate, she was recognized as the outstanding diversity leader in AI at COGEX conference. The reason for that is that she is not only actively trying to, again, recruit a diverse pool of talent for our practice, but she's very understanding. For example, about a year and a half ago, we proposed an idea to her that we start a community of practice within PwC, an AI community of practice. The idea is that before we put our resources in front of a client in a client-facing project under the pressure of a timeline and deliverable, we want them to work on really complex stuff, but also work on their leadership skills, on their presentation skills. So we actually, within that COP, we have many people who are BIPOC and other minorities, and we give them a chance to lead smaller teams, which are a team of their peers, but nevertheless, we give them an opportunity. So this in turn creates a really healthy life cycle, not only that they are acquired by the firm, but they have a chance to practice. So before we put them in front of a client, not only they've earned the respect and support of their peers, but they're really ready to go out there and make us proud.
Brianna, I'm just curious, is our similar work going on in academia? I'm slightly judging that it may not be, but I'm hoping it is.
No, I mean, it's definitely related. There's a lot of importance now being put around community collaboration. I personally encourage more collaboration with respect to methods as well as stakeholders, right? And we know that traditionally AI is evaluated using a lot of technical metric-centered approaches. But in recent years, I think it's great that a lot of us here in AI have become aware of how much there is to be gained from working with other stakeholders, complementary fields like law. We're seeing a lot of collaborations with sociologists, which is great. And then as well, like making sure that involving the communities that are actually being affected by these systems is very important, right? So there are a lot of, like nonprofit, government, and community-driven organizations who have really high stakes in the performances of these systems, right? I mean, this affects all of us, from issues like credit to employment, right? Incarceration. So I think it's a disservice to exclude those people and not communicate with them around the development of these AI systems and practices. And a lot of this, I think, comes from both awareness as well as education, right? So academics and practitioners who are like mixed methods, they have the potential for extreme impact, right? Because they're seeing in the way that they reason and act upon like these very widely deployed systems. And luckily we're seeing more efforts to train some of these interdisciplinary technologists. So definitely a similar angle on community and involvement of outside stakeholders.
Such an important part of diversity that I haven't been thinking of, because I usually think of it from the business side, or like working for the company or the users. But Mark Boyd's actually very good at this. I really recommend in the API space about looking for ecosystems and bringing people involved in it. But it's interesting because I think sometimes academia, especially in the further up you get into like machine learning, things like that, seems quite separated from society. So that's very exciting, because then you're able to build and even experiment and test more iteratively and be more up to date, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think, maybe traditionally you think of academia as kind of this ivory tower, very siloed from industry, government, things like that. But we're actually seeing a lot more collaboration, which is terrific, because obviously AI is maybe there's some developments that are made by academia, but it's deployed in industry, it's deployed everywhere, and it affects all of us. So being able to involve different communities as well as works amongst all of the different fields across, like industry and academic collaborations, you see a lot, right? I think Sean was a professor and now, she's in industry. So yeah, I mean, it's great to see a lot of that changing.
Fantastic. And that's just super interesting, the idea of the communities. I hadn't even had it in my head that, yeah, of course, obviously, which I always say in tech, like, remember when the original health app arrived on the iPhone, it didn't have period tracking. Like, that shows an obvious lack of talking to half of the community that you are serving. But yeah, that completely makes sense. And that's really good also, because we know there's a deep gap in education of government about technology. So working with them early on can hopefully have them understand it, instead of asking on the Congress of Mark Zuckerberg, what's Twitter? Real life really happened. So yeah, we've been talking a lot. Well, we've been covering all the topics, which is great because it's all intermingled in your work, clearly. But let's talk more about, if AI is the future, then we need to make it equitable. But how do we get those balanced data sets? Is there a way to use AI to achieve this? Or is it a chicken and egg situation where bias just box all over everything? So how do you make data sets more equitable? I think Bahar is nodding, really wanting to jump on that one.
Yes. So a misconception around AI is that AI is just one big bang when something is fed to a model and then a model starts making decision and, some very weird scenarios. But in the proper way of doing data science and training models, I always tell people that maybe you're surprised, a little bit disappointed, but our job in training these AI models is really an 80-20 effort, where 80% of our time is actually spent on preparing the data and going through the data and profile the data and understand whether it fits the problem. It's only 20% where you feed it to a model and you're trying to tune it to get the best performance out of it. Now, in that 80% of the time that we invest, we go through the data set to understand it, to profile it, to look at it from different angles. And this is where early on you can flag any unbalanced data set or skewed data set, and unless you actually have a good understanding and unless you understand the impact of that data on the model, you're not get a model, right? You're not gonna get a model that's gonna make those really biased decisions, right? And also when we look at the data set, it's not going to be subjective. Again, there are very straightforward formula or calculation and metrics that we teach our data scientists, but we also advise our data scientists at the client to be able to calculate. And we also tell them, look, at the end of the day, you may not score high on all fairness definitions. In fact, in one of the academic papers, we figured out that there's about 25 to 30 different definitions of fairness for a data set and a model. And truth of the matter is that some of them are mutually exclusive. So you're not going to score high on everything, but you're going to have a clear understanding and clear communication with the owners of the model. And at some point, you're going to find, a sweet spot where you're comfortable with a fair model, and you also have proof to provide it to the owner of the model, and that's how the model is trained, and then it's put to use, right? So for them to actually start calculating those, and there's going to be a little bit of an education piece where we talk about diversity and inclusion and the metrics that they have to go through. So again, I always say, like, the damage control is done way before your very first AI model is even trained, but you have to know what to look for. And at the end of the day, when you feed it to a model and you get the predictions, there are other additional ways that you can understand the impact of the data set. And I always say, yes, there are metrics and bar charts and fancy visualizations, but do a gut check at the end. And I always tell my clients, do a newspaper test. How would you feel if tomorrow your company ends up on a front page of a newspaper because you made a really biased hiring model, or a digital lending model, or asylum and immigration, or public justice, things that have very, very large impacts. So yes, there are numbers, but do that extra check. And we obviously within those checks, we have metrics for diversity and inclusion and fairness.
Still sounds quite subjective to me, and it worries me when the numbers are even worse for machine learning at times than it is for tech in general. Sean, I see you nodding along. How do y'all check and how do you measure the fairness of your data at your organization?
There's so many, one of the things that I studied as a professor was game theory, and a lot of this fairness stuff comes from game theoretic understandings of what's fair. And so just to put that into context for people, if they haven't heard of this before, if we think about what's fair when I'm cutting a cake into 3 pieces, should I cut it all equally so everybody gets the same size piece? What if there's a cherry in one place? Do I have to divide that into 3? Do I give a smaller piece with the cherry to one group and a larger pieces to the 2 other groups? So there's a lot of different ways that we can define fair. And that's the original literature that this stems from, and it's grown so much more and become applied to AI, which is really fascinating. And there's all different ways we can think about what's fair in the world. And certainly when you're making any decision about choosing anything, you have your own subjective answer about what's fair. And so those companies are making decisions, and those modelers are making decisions about what fair looks like at the end of the day. We think about this at Shelf Engine. I think about this more generally as there's always a long tail in any distribution over your population that you're making predictions for. And in that long tail, something's going to be missed. There's going to be some form of bias in there that's going to make it harder for you to predict about those things. And granted, in my industry, that looks like, turmeric juices. There are not very many of them. And so we tend to forecast improperly for turmeric juices. If you're part of the turmeric juice club, you definitely buy lots of turmeric juices when you think things are really, messy around immunity or something like that, like COVID is spiking, let's all go buy the turmeric juices. And that makes it a really hard thing for us to predict for, something really rare spikes at the long tail. It's really challenging for us. So for us, when we think about bias and these fairness, we partially think about what are the biases, where are our systematic errors in our machine learning or in our AI system? How do we create better optimization around that? How do we create a different model around that? Do we have to have a new feature? And then how do we aggregate that at the end towards some metric of what we'll call fairness, where we want to have, 20% in stock rate for turmeric juices, and that's what we consider to be fair. And so I think that even though the concept may be kind of removed, there are ways that every machine learning or every data science team or every AI product can think about fairness and incorporate that, because there is something that is going to be missed in their system in some way. And it's a question of, how do you want to treat that? How do you want to investigate that? How do you want to systematically identify that and then create the right, whether it's a newspaper check, a data check, a checklist, a manifest to run against, a model registry that has better information in it. There are lots of different ways that you can bring that in.
So it sounds like hipsters will be very happy, those listening, that they're still considered mathematically unpredictable and they're unique, but not really, because look at all the people that got the tumor. Just to wind down, Brianna, what are some topics that, like, what is in demand now? What are the skills needed that people should be looking for and to study up on?
I mean, I mentioned this a little bit earlier, but I think, interdisciplinary scholars and practitioners are in high demand. We need people who are trained not just technically, but also who are considering, the social and the ethical dimensions of the systems that they're deploying, right? It's not enough anymore to just look at the metrics. And I'm very glad that we're seeing some consensus across academia and industry with respect to that point. So, I mean, like I said, collaboration, very important. We're seeing a lot more of that. Continued scrutiny on both sides, right? That's a very important, not just for us as researchers to consider what can constantly be improved, but also for practitioners to say, not only how can our systems work better, but how can they work better for everyone, right? And, it's hard because there's a lot of context to consider when you're doing something like, measurement and evaluation. You have to understand, what exists and what can be improved, as well as, how do you go about evaluating this system in relation to another system? And it's great, I mean, we're still kind of at the infancy of doing all of this, but I'm very hopeful, and I think that the fact that it's kind of become this widespread discussion, we're seeing a lot of industry and government adoption of, responsibility and transparency in AI. We're seeing these discussions in Congress, which is great. So yeah, I mean, all in all, I think, that's why we're here. And I think it's important work, and I'm glad that there are more people doing it.
It still sounds quite subjective, all of what y'all are describing to me as an outsider. Brianna, well, what is some advice you would give to someone trying to enter this field?
Interesting. I would say, become educated in many different domains, right? Don't just focus on computer science. Computer science is obviously very important. If you want to be a data scientist, computer scientist, but it's important now, especially with technologists, to consider the issues from every angle, right? Particularly in policy, we're seeing a lot of that emerging. We're seeing, the Arize of, civic tech. We're seeing, tech for good. There's this new emergence of like technologists for the public interest. That's huge. So I would say, just because you are interested in AI doesn't mean you have to be, a computer scientist. There are a lot of ways to kind of go about this issue, and we need everyone, all hands on deck. So.
Absolutely. Sean, build on that. What would you add to that?
I would say, it's important for women at all levels to understand how to advocate for themselves, how to ask for whatever it is the right thing for them to do the best on their job, but also do the best to build their own story. So women are always, or any individual is always adding to some sort of narrative about themselves that they're going to take to their next job. They're building their story for their career and for themselves. So understanding and getting a really crisp understanding with your manager or with your peers about, and with your network about what is it about this job that I'm doing right now, or this task, or this paper that I'm writing in academia, around what is it that's going to give me that added value to my portfolio so that I can continue towards something, and understanding how those objectives fit together. So advocate for yourself, understand and build that strength to advocate for yourself, ask for coaching, ask for direct feedback, and constantly do that, because it's not about performing at this one job. It's not about just performing at this one class or on this one paper or in this one field. The fields are expanding. So take advantage and grow yourself and invest in yourself.
Very good. Bahar, what's your last advice for our audience?
Yeah, sure. So continuing on what Sean said, even at PwC, I know that we are on the one side of the table doing all the interviewing and talent acquisition, but my colleagues and I, many of us actually, we mentor people, we make ourselves available for other female, in a broader sense in STEM, but specifically in AI and data science as well, where we're more than happy to have a coffee chat with you, to do mock interviews with you, to do whatever it takes for you to feel confident. But ultimately, at the end of the day, what we want to see happen more is for them to actually come forward and start applying for the position that they're comfortable with. Again, part of the learning will come on the job. AI is a very fast-paced domain. All of us are still learning. All of us are trying to tame this beast and understand it in a responsible and use it in a responsible way. And just don't wait until you become perfect and learn anything. There is no way that we can all catch up with this. While they're contemplating whether they're fit for a position, their male counterparts are already applying. And while they are, the female ones are still struggling to think if they're still ready enough, their male counterparts are getting seniority in their positions, right? Don't do that. Come forward, talk to us, let us coach you, let us mentor you. And my one last advice is, I know we have a lot of students these days now that they're going through masters in AI, masters in management AI, and these related degrees. But I want to make sure that when they're learning the computer science side of it, if your curriculum does not have anything on responsible AI, go actively outside and look for it. There is a ton of thought leadership that's out there. There is at least a ton from PwC and from my working group. I know that for sure. And educate yourself on that. Be able to have a conversation around the impact of AI and not just what it takes to train a model. And that will make you stand out from the rest of the crowd who apply.
Thank you all so much. Thank you, Brianna, Sean, and Bahar. And thank you, Arize, for sponsoring this conversation or bringing us together for this conversation. And thank you, audience. Please go into the Slack community. We can definitely continue the conversation. I think we have a lot of resources to share. And also there were a lot of questions there was no time to get to at a live conference. And then thank you to those that are listening later at the recording. Please share it. Please continue this conversation. We're just starting it. Everything is so nascent and we've got to work to protect each other and to protect our future. So thanks y'all and enjoy the rest of the event.